Welcome to Mental Health Monday. My name is Mick Coyle. Coming up on the programme this week.
In the past, we've just not done anywhere near enough to support people with their mental health. We're beginning to see more people asking for help now. We're beginning to see health services trying to respond to that, but inevitably they're having to run really, really fast to catch up with levels of need in the population that do appear, with all the evidence we've got, to be actually increasing. I mean, these are extraordinary numbers, aren't they? And I think it points to the fact that, first of all, mental health problems are common, but they're also incredibly serious. If we get this right and we actually provide people with the support they want and need, then there will be huge improvements in both mental and physical health for the whole population.
Yeah, welcome along to another cracking episode of Mental Health Monday, the home of the UK's conversation about mental health. And we are setting out in detail the UK's relationship with mental health, because I'm joined on the podcast this week by the Chief Exec of the Centre for Mental Health, who alongside organisations like Mind have pulled together a real comprehensive look at where we're at when it comes to our mental health in the UK. The Big Mental Health Report 2024 is the first of its type. It won't be the last though, and each and every year the same report will chart the rise and fall of issues that we have around mental health within social sectors, within the workplace, within our young people. We'll look at the number of sick days that are being taken. We'll look at the big picture when it comes to mental health. And so often we're looking for the big picture. We're looking for the data that shows the need to take action around the UK's mental health situation. And of course, that's what this podcast has been about for 340 previous episodes. So let's spend some time now looking at where we're at heading into 2025, what steps we can take, what recommendations are being talked about in terms of moving things forward, and really getting a sense of understanding that although it might be very difficult to hear, given how much great work goes on in the mental health world, that the mental health sector is really a place which is having to deal with more and more people, and is also having to shoulder the burden of some of society's issues that go beyond what we traditionally consider to be mental health issues. It's a really fascinating conversation with the Chief Exec, Andy Bell, and I'd urge you just to sort of soak up as much as you can about the state of where we're at, because it's really going to set the tone, if you like, for where we'll move to in the future. The Big Mental Health Report 2024 is out now. I'll put a link to that in the podcast notes so you can check it out. But I started off by asking Andy about why it was so important that a conversation like this takes place and that this report pulls all the data that we've got together into one place. My name's Mick Coyle. You can check me out on social media. Links to that in the podcast notes. Do get involved. If you've got recommendations for guests, I would love to hear from you. First up, let's hear from Andy.
We know mental health is a really important part of our lives. If we don't have good mental health, we don't have good health, and it has a huge effect on the way we live and our quality of life, and indeed how long we expect to live for. So we know our mental health is really important to us as people, and we know that traditionally it's been overlooked. Within the health service, it's often less important in people's minds than physical health. It very seldom gets taken seriously by governments in the way it needs to. And so we think it's really important to highlight what's going on with the people's mental health over time, doing that each year so that we have a way of kind of holding systems to account, but also sharing with the public what's going on and encouraging people to take action to do the things that will help to make life an awful lot better for people.
When we look at sort of the need to take action, there's a headline figure of £300 billion cost to the economy of poor mental health in the UK. Can you give me a sense of where that money is going, where we're losing? It's twice the budget of the NHS. It's a huge amount of money. Give us a sense of how you've come to that figure.
Yeah, thank you. So it's an economic and social cost, and it comes in three parts. So the first part is the effects on the economy. So, for example, if people are unwell because of their mental health and they're unable to work, or they're not able to work as well as they would like to, we know that has an effect on economic activity. Um, there is also a cost of providing health and care services, and some of that is provided by the NHS and local government. But just as much is provided by informal family carers, and that comes at a cost too, because that means that they may not be able to work, for example. But there's also a huge quality of life part of it as well. And whenever decisions are being made about, for example, what health treatments the NHS provides, they think about the effect of quality of life of a particular illness or condition. So we've included that as well, and that's a hugely important part of it. So what's really interesting is a lot of these economic and social costs actually fall on people with mental health difficulties and their families. This isn't just a cost to government, though there is a cost to government. It's a cost to all of us, and particularly those who are struggling with their mental health.
The fact that the report says that the cost of poor mental health in the UK is £300 billion, some people might go, it can't be that. But even if you've overestimated by twice as much, and it's £150 billion, that would still be an absolutely astronomical amount. Even if you've overestimated by two-thirds and it's only £100 billion, that's still an astronomical amount of money. And actually, what this report kind of says, fix mental health and actually fix so many of the UK's problems.
I mean, we deliberately underestimated it. So when we were looking at the costs, we only included things we were confident about. So, for example, we know people living with long-term physical conditions like diabetes, asthma, heart disease, cancer experience really significant mental health difficulties because of that. And it often affects the quality of the treatment they get from the NHS and indeed their outcomes. We think that's probably equivalent to about £1 in 10 of all NHS spend, but we didn't include it because the data isn't as strong as it is in other areas. We didn't include many other things. We didn't include the cost of poor mental health among children in education. But we know that children who are experiencing mental health difficulties at school do less well and have poorer outcomes throughout the whole of their lives. So if anything, it's a very, very careful, considered estimate and probably the least that you could say it actually equates to.
No, that's a great answer, Andy. And actually, it puts into mind as well the fact that sometimes you've got to justify these things financially, in a world where really we should do this because it's the right thing to do. That human connection should be enough. Let's talk about the proliferation of mental health problems across, society. And there's a really interesting breakdown. And we've heard the suicide figures this year for England and Wales, more than 6,000 lives lost. 17% at any one time living with a common mental health issue. 8% there or thereabouts regularly struggling with loneliness. There was one stat in particular that really concerned me, was that 1 in 8 17 to 19-year-olds had eating difficulties or an eating disorder, with that figure 4 times higher when you looked at women compared to men. Whichever section of society you were looking at, Andy, you're picking out numbers of people who are struggling with their mental health, and significant numbers of people who are struggling with their mental health.
I mean, these are extraordinary numbers, aren't they? And I think it points to the fact that, first of all, mental health problems are common. Um, but they're also incredibly serious. Having an eating disorder is incredibly serious, and it can have very, very profound effects on a person's life. So these things really do need to be taken very, very seriously. And I think traditionally what's happened is people struggling with their mental health have not been sure whether they should seek help or not, often waiting until things have got really bad because there is still some stigma attached, less than there used to be, but there is still a fear that you'll be treated less well, that you won't be taken seriously if you ask for help. So there's all sorts of reasons why in the past we've just not done anywhere near enough to support people with their mental health. We're beginning to see more people asking for help now. We're beginning to see health services trying to respond to that, but inevitably they're having to run really, really fast to catch up with levels of need in the population that do appear, with all the evidence we've got, to be actually increasing.
And the consequences are clear as well. Those people who are living with mental health issues or illnesses, they earn less, they live a considerably shorter life as well than those. So actually, there's a very human cost isn't there? In two ways to living with a mental health condition.
Well, that's right, and I think that's the important thing. And as you said, the most important case for supporting mental health is the human case. The economic case should only ever be in support of that. And we know that if you have particularly a long-term mental illness, one that goes on for a long time and affects you kind of very significantly in your life, um, the chances are you will have a much shorter life. And most of that is due to the fact that people with mental illness are predominantly on lower incomes, predominantly in less good housing. Uh, some of the medications given people to look after their mental health cause physical side effects. We have very high rates of smoking, for example, and again, that's the way people are managing their emotions, but it causes very significant harm to physical health. So, once again, if you can improve people's mental health, you can also improve physical health at the same time. So, if we get this right and we actually provide people with the support they want and need, then there will be huge improvements in both mental and physical health for the whole population.
Can I ask you about the sort of rise of issues like depression and anxiety? I tend to find in my experience of speaking to people, there's something more insidious about those because they can affect many different people in many different walks of life in a way that maybe traditional illnesses might target certain people who live in certain areas or have certain factors in their lifestyles. Um, but with depression and anxiety, and the report says 1 in 4 personal independent claims, the PIP claims, were coming from people with depression, and it just goes to show how much that genie is out of the bottle now. That actually those cases around things like depression and anxiety are very, very common to the point where when I saw that stat, I then understood why we had a minister in the previous government talk about depression and about how basically people shouldn't be using that as an excuse to not have to go to work because presumably he'd seen the stats which were showing that increasing numbers of people on PIP claims were actually struggling with depression. But that just goes to show, doesn't it, how widespread depression is as an issue.
Yeah, I mean, depression and anxiety are both incredibly common, and they often come together for many people will experience both at the same time. And I think it's also important to remember how disabling they can be. If you are living with depression, it's sometimes called a mild mental health problem. Well, anyone who's lived with depression will tell you it wasn't very mild actually, and a lot of us will experience this at some point in our lives. If 1 in 4 of us are experiencing it every year, then across our lives, many of us will have it from time to time. Some people will have it for a very long time. For people with the most significant situations, it can be something which is with you kind of year after year, sometimes on and off, but it can be a part of your life throughout. For some people, it may be something that follows particularly difficult episodes in life. But it is incredibly important, and again, it's a very serious condition. For people who are claiming disability benefits, I think what we also noticed is it often co-occurs with physical illness or disability. And again, we know that if you have a physical health problem, you're more likely to have poor mental health as well. So depression often goes hand in hand with physical illness. So although 1 in 4 people claiming PIP might have depression, they may be claiming it for another reason, but they also have depression largely due to how incredibly challenging life is with a long-term condition.
In terms of those sort of spikes that you see, and I know you pulled the data in from many different sort of means, current studies, the YouGov sort of work as well, in terms of the polling that's gone into it as well. Is there a sense, Andy, in any way, what potentially is causing those spikes? I mean, you don't have to look far beyond the cost of living crisis, the after effects of the pandemic, but then we can look a little bit broader and we can look at the sort of the way that social media sort of crept in as well, which is increasingly becoming a part of people's lives, their sense of perception of themselves in the world around them. Is there a sense in the report or from the findings of the report around what are some of the drivers around some of these increases?
Yeah, I think that's the thing that we're still learning and trying to kind of figure out. Um, and so there's no doubt in the last few years that the after effects of the pandemic have been very significant, particularly for children and young people. Uh, we know that whenever there are difficult economic times, you see higher rates of certainly mental distress, which can lead to mental ill health. Um, you put people under intolerable pressure, and eventually it affects their mental health. So I think we can certainly say that, but we've also seen a gradual increase in the years running up to the pandemic. That may be due to just the kind of increasing stress in life. School pressures, for example, is something that young people talk about a lot, the kind of teach to test culture in schools. Um, Digital and social media seem to be part of it, but not straightforward. The evidence, for example, around screen time is not as clear cut as you might expect it to be. So we need to look at really, really carefully at what we think are the reasons and what aren't actually the reasons. And the likelihood is it's a bit of everything, but certainly increasing social inequality does appear to be a major marker. The more unequal a society gets, the higher rates of mental ill health you see.
Absolutely, absolutely. You mentioned young people there. The need for hubs for young people is something which has been talked about and is gaining momentum as well. This idea that on almost every high street there would be a place where you can go and have a conversation and sometimes an informal conversation about how you're feeling. Um, I'd advocate for them for adults as well as children, but I know that's the focus around young people at the moment. But when you've done the study and looked at sort of roles within the things like the NHS and the mental health workforce, even in the current state of what we've got at the moment, 1 in 5 job roles are currently free. So we don't have enough people sort of filling those roles. And I'm sure we'd all like to see more and more services that are out there. But the services that we've got at the moment currently aren't matching the need that's out there, and there aren't enough people in those roles either. So mm, that's a disjoint, isn't it, in terms of ambition, current need, and where we need to be in, say, 3 years' time, 5 years' time, or beyond.
Yeah, it absolutely is, and you're completely right. We the biggest limiting factor on how quickly we can build mental health services is how quickly we can bring a workforce together of people with the right skills, the right knowledge, who are working safely with people who are after all, in need of good, compassionate, effective support. You can't do mental health services on the cheap. Um, so it's really important that we have continued investment in services, that we keep building up the workforce. But I think the point about hubs is really important because we don't just need more of the same of what we've got now. A lot of what we've got now is kind of specialist care, if you like, for people with the most severe needs. But of course, what happens is that people whose needs are a little bit earlier on are told, come back when you're more unwell, because all of the investment is in services at the kind of higher end. And that inevitably means that we're kind of just stacking up more problems for later. So it's really important we have different types of support at different levels of need. So things like high street hubs for young people, investing in the work of local community organizations, youth services, support for older people to have more social connection. If we're investing in the things that prevent mental health difficulties or give people help early, we can stop them becoming so severe they need those more specialized services later. So we need a more diverse range of mental health supports available. And of course, the earlier help is both better for people and lower cost.
No, absolutely. And in terms of that, and that's in terms of the calls to action, if you like, from the report, the idea of a timely response is really, really crucial. Can I actually, just before we come on to those points about what the report kind of shows that we need, and there are 4 key points, 4 key asks, if you like. But in terms of just gathering this data and pulling this data together, do you feel like we have a full sense of the nation's mental health? And do you get this as the decision makers fully understand the needs of the nation when it comes to mental health and the effects of poor mental health on the nation? Because, of course, we're never going to get that appropriate response until it's fully clear what the consequences are. Now, the risks, as you've just pointed out there, a little bit like with the pandemic, it's only when people start dying do you start taking action. Yet, quite clearly, the suicide figures have never really been enough for a government to really, really take this seriously and treat it as the pandemic that it almost certainly is. Those calls to action that you've got, do you think that the government fully will understand, and reports like this will help government and decision makers fully understand the need to take action on this point.
Well, we hope it will. And hopefully the fact we're doing it year on year will mean that we'll be able to build that evidence as we go, though I'd rather not wait. I'd rather see a kind of proper, holistic, full-on government response to this and an NHS response to this now. This can't wait and it shouldn't wait. People's lives are being affected very, very severely by it. I think what we've done is tried to pull together everything we've got into a single volume. That doesn't mean we know everything. There's a whole bunch of stuff we don't yet know. As we acknowledge, we don't know entirely why we're seeing rising levels of mental ill health and whether that would eventually go down again. We hope it will. We don't want to keep reporting on rising levels of mental illness. It would be nice to see that kind of plateauing or dropping. So I think we know as much as we are able to gather, but of course, it's been an under-researched area. We don't ask the right questions. Think about all the times children are asked about their physical health and their height and weight when they're at school. Very few people ask children about their mental health and well-being when they're at school, or do anything about it, even if they ask. So we're still very, very much at the foothills of really responding appropriately to the levels of need that are out there. But I very much hope that national government takes this seriously, and that's the national governments across the four UK nations, but also local government, the combined authorities in many parts of the country now, and indeed the people making decisions in the NHS locally about how they spend their resource. We hear far too many examples still of mental health services not getting appropriate, fair levels of funding compared to other services because they're just not taken as seriously.
Absolutely. I'll put the links to the report in the podcast notes so people can go and read, particularly those recommendations about a timely response, so that when people do flag that they've got an issue, that it's there's a process in place there. Supporting young people, we've touched on that as well, with the opportunities there. Tackling stigma and discrimination, which is this age-old battle, which is a one which is being won, but it's being won very, very slowly. And don't know about you, Andy. Every so often, I'll have conversations or see moments where I suddenly go, goodness me, that person has not engaged with that conversation or these developments at all. And that will continue, I'm sure, to happen. And also those social factors, the inequality around that as well, all really crucial points. Can I ask you, Andy, are there any sort of, I know the answer is no, but if we talk about sort of magic bullets or golden bullets, are there simple things? There's a new government in place now, and I imagine that new government, and I'm seeing in terms of the wider role that I do, that they're taking in quite a lot of information about the country and the state of the country that they've inherited from the previous government who were in power for 14 years or so. Are there simple things that they could do, mindset changes or actions that you think would make a big difference so that we don't have to wait for next year's report and report on an increase in X or Y, but actually we could do something today, that governments could take steps today?
Absolutely, there are. There are simple things that could generate bigger changes. So, one of the things we've said is we think government should institute a mental health policy test. It's a really simple idea. Any policy you're making in any part of government, what effect is this likely to have on people's mental health and people with a mental illness? You can then make sure you're gearing up policies to have beneficial impacts, because we know that it's not just things that happen in health and the NHS that affect people's mental health. It's policies around schools. It's policies around the justice system, the benefit system, work and employment, climate change. So if we had a mental health policy text, it would be a simple, very, very low cost way of government ensuring that everything it does tries to have a net positive impact on people's mental health and well-being. There are lots of things the new government's doing that have promise in that way. Things like improving renters' rights and workers' rights. They could all contribute positively to people's mental health and well-being. So I think it's about doing that across the whole of government systematically. That would make, just in itself, it would cost virtually nothing. And it could be done, tomorrow. And it would, over time, make a significant difference.
And I wanted to ask you whether or not, Andy, in terms of data, I think data is always very helpful because it gives you a sense of things. But you guys have had to work, in overdrive to pull this all together. Sort of a centralized system. I'm almost an advocate for this idea that we'd have almost like a 3-digit mental health helpline. They're almost like a central point for mental health in the UK, so that you could see when issues were arising around eating disorders. So you can see where issues at the moment, it's a charity's reporting or a charity looks back to their data and find. I always get the sense that there could almost be a little bit more done in that real time space, whereby there would be a central point. And I use I use the helpline as an idea. If you don't feel fine, call 789 or whatever it would be, that suddenly you could judge that on an almost daily basis, as we're actually seeing a big increase in calls on this. And actually that response could be a much more pragmatic response potentially. But you could also spot where those trends were, the times of the year. And it would be so much more easier for the government to then go, we can see the problems here because we have that daily data of people reaching out, and there'll be digital ways of doing it as well, and social ways of doing it, I'm sure, as well, but almost like a more centralized network, if you like.
Yeah, I think that that's a really good idea. I mean, we now have 111 option 2. So unless you're in a kind of urgent, kind of life-threatening crisis, in which case you could call 999, there is now that kind of urgent response line that you can call no matter where you are in England, at least. And as you say, it would be perfectly possible to capture data from that. And data is really important to create accountability as long as people use it as such. We think it's really important that we have proper waiting time standards for mental health services. We all know the waiting times for elective surgery because they're put in front of us all the time, aren't we? And there's that big, and it's a big number right now. There are lots and lots of people waiting for mental health support for very long periods of time sometimes. And there isn't the same accountability for that. We don't have that same visibility. And that's really putting people with mental health difficulties at a disadvantage. So it's really important we have clear data. It's really important we understand that clear data and what it means. Sometimes data can be misused. But it's also important that people are able to get hold of that and use it and understand it. And as you say, we can then respond to trends. I think it's very positive now that in local areas, there's much more real-time data about suicide deaths, so that local areas can respond more appropriately when they're noticing changes. And that's really powerful and will really help to prevent people losing their lives. So if we can do something similar on a national level, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, and a great example there of, the waiting list for mental health. You look at those sort of issues, and the 4 asks, the timely response. You can't get a timely response if you've got to go on a waiting list, but there's almost that sense of, well, should I say something? I know I'm gonna have to wait, so there's no point even flagging it. That talks about stigma and discrimination. The people who are affected by that are much less likely to interact with services are those from different backgrounds. That factors in the social factors as well. And of course, young people, you'll need to look at the data around young people. That's a great example, actually, where it almost shows the need for all of those 4 things, because they'd all work, they'd all pull together, they'd all make a difference.
Yeah, and I think the important thing is that we do need that whole of government approach to it, and indeed whole society approach to it. Businesses have a role to play in supporting mental health and well-being among their workers, their customers, and the communities they serve. So this isn't just about waiting for government to do stuff. We can all do something. Schools and colleges and universities can take action to improve mental health and well-being. Local councils, obviously, they've got really significant financial challenges right now, but they can be at the heart of improving mental health and well-being in the places they serve. There's so many things that we can and should be doing, and it's sad that we're not doing as much as we could right now to prevent poor mental health. And as you rightly say, there are deep and entrenched inequalities. The only reason why we see higher rates of mental ill health among people from particularly Black communities in the UK is racism. It's discrimination, it's mistreatment, it is abuse and violence. So we need to understand that if we tackle homophobia and transphobia, for example, if we tackle racism wherever it finds itself, we will have better mental health and well-being.
Absolutely.
Andy, thank you so much for your time. The big Mental Health Report 2024 is out now. I look forward to this being an annual chat, Andy, where we can catch up each year, talk about those trends as well. Let's hope those trends and the arrows are pointing in the right direction. I think we kind of get a sense of maybe that might not be the case for next year, but let's hope that, you know, as things improve and as the government sort of takes a look at this, that it acts and looks at those recommendations. Things don't always happen very quickly in this space, but fingers crossed we can really start to see that difference. If it's next year, if it's the year after, let's make sure those conversations are continuing. Thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate you joining us today.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
I hope you've enjoyed this week's podcast. Thanks for checking out Mental Health Monday. My name is Mick Coyle. You can find me on Twitter at Mr. Mick Coyle. You can also find me, Mick Coyle, on Facebook as well. Don't forget, if you want to speak to somebody about your mental health, you can do so. The Samaritans, free to call on 116 123. You can find mental health services where you are. Just look for the Hub of Hope. Type in your postcode. It'll find those mental health services close to you. And for support in a crisis, you can text SHOUT to 85258. That's if you're experiencing a personal crisis, you're unable to cope and need support. Shout to 85258. That's a text line. Do get involved in those services. In an absolute emergency, always remember the number to call is 999. Thanks for downloading the podcast this week. We'll be back next week with more Mental Health Monday.